Hello, today I'm excited because I'm going to be talking about Izumi Shikibu, but more specifically, I'm going to be talking about the Izumi Shikibu Nikki. So I'm going to explain to you really quick the sections that I'm going to have in this video. I'm going to start by telling you the translation options that you have available in English to read and which translation I think you should read, and then I'm going to have a section on Edwin A. Cranston, who is the author of the translation that I think you should read, and then I'm going to give you just a really brief outline of Izumi Shikibu's life. Then I'm going to talk about Izumi Shikibu's life pre the Izumi Shikibu Nikki. Then I'm going to talk about Izumi Shikibu's life post Izumi Shikibu Nikki. And then the last section is just going to be miscellaneous because there's just a few things that I want to touch on and talk about. And so I'm just going to put them in at the end and call it miscellaneous section. So let's get started. Do you not know this world is a waking dream? However much I once needed you, that is also a fleeting thing. So there are two translations that you can read in English of the Izumi Shikibu Nikki. The first one was published in 1920 and it is by Annie Shepley Amori and Kochi Doi. The second translation that you can read was published in 1969 by Edwin A. Cranston. So going to the first one, the Amori and Doi translation, like I said, this was published in 1920 and you can find it on Project Gutenberg, but it is called, I think it's Diaries of Court Ladies of Old Japan is what it's called. And it has not just the Izumi Shikibu Nikki, but it also has their translation of the Murasaki Shikibu Nikki and the Sarashina Nikki. But at the bottom of it, so the last one in that text is their translation of the Izumi Shikibu Nikki. But you can find some places that have published just their translation of the Izumi Shikibu Nikki. I know there is one published by, I think it's called Toyo Press, and it is the Amori and Doi translation, but it is that translation, and it's kind of been edited and fixed a bit by William DeLange. And William DeLange does do a pretty good job, I would say, at trying to fix the Amori and Doi translation, but at the end of the day, the Amori and Doi translation just really isn't that good, and I really would not recommend reading it. And then, like I said, the second one was in 1969 by Edwin A. Cranston, and this you can only read on Internet Archive. You can purchase a copy, but you're gonna have to spend some cash. It's very expensive, so yeah, don't recommend spending that money to buy it, obviously. But you can just read it on Internet Archive, which is where I read it. You don't have to pay any money for Internet Archive, I promise. You just make a free account and you can borrow it for an hour or for 14 days. So out of these two, since I did already kind of say that the Amori and Doi translation isn't that great, I 1000% recommend the Edwin A. Cranston translation. His translation of the Izumi Shikibu Nikki is so good. It's incredible, honestly. And the Amori and Doi translation is just very poor. If you want to enjoy the Izumi Shikibu Nikki in any way, don't read the Amori and Doi translation. I don't want to come off as like ungrateful or anything for the work that they did, because obviously they were the first ones to translate the Izumi Shikibu Nikki into English, and I am grateful for that. But I'm just saying, since there's a better translation available, avoid the one from 1920. And I really wish Edwin A. Cranston's translation and his book could be reprinted somehow, because there are a lot of people who just don't like having to read on a computer, on Internet Archive. I read it on my iPad is how I read books on Internet Archive. I know a lot of people don't like doing that. They like to read in a physical format, which with Edwin A. Cranston is just not possible unless you're willing to drop some money. And even then, I don't think there's that many copies available to purchase. And I know that the Mother Michitsuna Nikki and the Sarashina Nikki and the Murasaki Shikibu Nikki, which are all popular Nikkis from that period, Heian Japan period, have been republished and reprinted. You probably have heard of them, The Gossamer Years and As I Crossed the Bridge of Dreams. I just need somebody I don't know if it's Harvard University Press that I need to plead my case to. I don't know who it is. But I need somebody to fix this catastrophe. This is hurting our civilization. I'm not kidding, okay? We gotta have this Edwin A. Cranston translation of the Izumi Shikibu Nikki republished or reprinted. I think that Harvard, as a way to help commemorate one of their best professors, just saying, should reprint the book. Please. And here's my thing, Harvard University Press, if you reprint this book, I can assure you, without a doubt, that you will have at least one buyer. That's me. If you make it at a reasonable price, please. But I'm sure they will. It's not gonna be like, even if it was like $20, $20, that's so much for a book. But even I would do it. For Edwin A. Cranston, I would do it. Again, I don't know how any of it works, but I hope that somehow, someday, this beautiful book can be republished or reprinted. I don't know, but the way that it is done, the book in its entirety is perfect. I literally don't think there's any way it can get better. There's no improvement that needs to be done on it. I think it's incredible. The introduction is so good. He gives such a good, thorough introduction, and he also has such good notes. In fact, Edwin A. Cranston's translation is the first complete and annotated translation of the Izumi Shikibu Nikki. In 1920, they didn't have access to as many manuscripts as Edwin A. Cranston would later have access to. So Edwin A. Cranston had access to an actual complete manuscript of the Izumi Shikibu Nikki and more quality, or I should say higher quality manuscripts that Amori and Joy did not have access to. I'm going to stop yapping about the translation, and I'm going to now get into Edwin A. Cranston himself. What sorrow it is to live in anguish in this world that is no more real than an evening's dream. So Edwin A. Cranston attended college at the University of Arizona, Tucson, where he got his Bachelor of Arts in English. And then after graduating, he joined the Navy, and he spent 2 years in Japan. And this 2 years in Japan is where he became interested in Japanese literature. Upon returning to the United States, he would go to University of California, Berkeley for graduate school, and then he would transfer to Stanford. And he would end up getting his PhD in Stanford. He submitted his dissertation, which was the Izumi Shikibu Nikki translation, in December of 1965, and he would receive his PhD in 1966, and he would officially join Harvard faculty in 1965, and then he would become a full professor by 1972. So he originally was an instructor, and then he became an assistant professor, and then a full professor by 1972. He would end up teaching for 56 years. So he ended up retiring in June of 2021 and then passed away in December of 2021. And like I said, he translated the Izumi Shikibu Nikki for his dissertation, which he submitted in 1965. And then this book he would publish in 1969 with Harvard University Press. So I'm not sure how much of this is different from his original dissertation. He says in the introduction that this book was an outgrowth of his doctoral dissertation. And I think one of the things that makes this translation so good is because Cranston's main love was Japanese poetry, and he would go on in his career to publish thousands of English translations of Japanese poetry. And another thing that I think is really cool is that he became interested in translating the Izumi Shikibu Nikki because in 1963 he went to a seminar at Stanford that was done by Seidensticker, which Seidensticker is, if I say his name right, he is a huge translator in classical Japanese Heian Japan literature. He has his own Tale of Genji translation. He's kind of one of those, at least I see him as one of those pioneers of translations of Heian Japan literature into English. So just knowing that Edwin A. Cranston went to a seminar by Seidensticker, and that's how he became interested in the Izumi Shikibu Nikki, and then went on to do it for his dissertation, I just think it's so cool, and I love it. Okay, so now I'm going to finally get into Izumi Shikibu herself, and I'm going to start by just giving you a brief overview of her life. Never did I think that I myself, still living, not forgetting, would become the keepsake you have left behind. So it's not known exactly when she's born. Some people say dates in the late 960s, some people say some dates in the 970s, some people say early 980s. So I'm going to be saying that she is born sometime in the 970s. By 999, she is married to a man named Tachibana no Michisada and has one daughter, Koshikibu. Again, these dates of when she got married and when she had her first child are not known exactly, but it is known she was married and had her daughter by 999. Then her relationship with Prince Tamataka, which is one of her famous relationships, was from 1000 to 1002. Then her relationship with Prince Atsumichi, which is another one of her famous relationships, was from 1003 to 1007. Then she becomes a lady-in-waiting for Empress Shoshi in 1009. Then she ends up getting married again, but the date of when she gets married isn't known. I'm just going to put 1012. It's not known exactly when she gets married for a second time. She gets married to Fujiwara no Yasumasa. It's sometime after she becomes a lady-in-waiting for Empress Shoshi, so I'm just going to say 1012. And then her first daughter, Koshikibu, passes away in 1025, and then it is assumed that Izumi Shikibu passes away sometime in the 1030s. Again, the date of her death is not exactly known, but most scholars that I can see all agree that it's probably somewhere in the 1030s that she passes away. Also on this, I'm going to include 2 extra dates. I'm going to put 1005, where there is one poem included by her in the 3rd Imperial Waka Anthology. And then I'm going to put 1086, where there were 67 poems included by her in the 4th Imperial Waka Anthology. And I'll talk more about these later, but I think these are important to show her progression in terms of the quality and fame of her poems. So that's it for the brief timeline. Now we're going to actually get more into detail about all these events, and we're going to start by talking about her life pre the Izumi Shikibu Nikki. Even a dream can be trusted while it lasts, but deluded is the man who spends his life thinking the real is real. So the Izumi Shikibu Nikki starts in 1003, so we're going to be talking about her childhood, at least what's known about it, up until 1003. So the most likely candidate for her father is Oeno Masamune, who was a provincial governor, and her mother, the name is not known, but she was a lady-in-waiting for Empress Masako. Now this would have meant that Izumi Shikibu most likely grew up surrounded in court culture. The reason for this is because not only was her mother a lady-in-waiting to an empress at court, but also her father, Oeno Masamune, had held at one point a position in Misako's household. So this would have allowed Izumi Shikibu to spend a lot of time at court. And then she would end up marrying Tachibana no Michisada. Again, don't know when, but at least before 999. And since they had a daughter by then, you can assume maybe in the early 990s. Don't really know, but Tachibana no Michisada was also a provincial governor. From Tachibana no Michisada, we can see where Izumi Shikibu gets part of her name, because Tachibana no Michisada at one point would become the governor of the Izumi province in Japan. And so when they're married at one point, he becomes governor of Izumi, and this is where the first part of her name comes from, because Izumi Shikibu, as is the case with most ladies from Heian Japan, was not her real name. It was a nickname, and that's what most ladies in Heian Japan, especially court ladies, they would go by nicknames typically. And Izumi clearly comes from her husband, Tachibana no Michisada, and then the Shikibu part comes from her father, who at one point held a position in the Ministry of Ceremonials, which is called the Shikibusho. So that Shikibu part, just like with Murasaki Shikibu, her father held a position in the Shikibusho at one point as well. So now you know where her name, Izumi Shikibu, comes from. And then again, they had one daughter together named Koshikibu. And when she was married to Tachibana no Michisada, she most likely would alternate between living with him in the provinces and living with her father in the capital. Her most famous relationships are with Prince Tamataka and Prince Atsumichi. And it's in 1000, where her relationship with Prince Tamataka begins. And it's not known exactly how they meet, but I know Edwin A. Cranston, at least, is the only one I could ever find, or anyone I read, who talked about the possibilities of how they met. And he says that the way that it seemed they most likely met, because Izumi Shikibu's mother was a lady-in-waiting for Empress Masako, that Izumi Shikibu could also have worked in her court as well, and so also been a lady-in-waiting to Empress Masako. And Empress Masako would pass away in 1000, and so it's possible that while Empress Masako was sick, Prince Tamataka, a stepchild of hers, would come visit Empress Masako, because Empress Masako was the principal wife of Emperor Reize, at the time retired Emperor Reize. She did not have any children, and so he would have two other wives. One of those wives was Choshi, who was a sister of Michinaga, and she had Prince Tamataka, Prince Atsumichi, and who would later become Emperor Sanjo. And he did also have another son by another lady, I don't remember her name though, and that was who would later become Emperor Kazan. And so it's possible that when Empress Masako was sick and ill and nearing the end of her life, that Prince Tamataka would come make visits, and that's possibly where Prince Tamataka and Izumi Shikibu would have met. I don't know. That's not for certain. I'm not telling you that's exactly how it happened, but that is a possibility of how they met, because their relationship does begin in 1000, and that corresponds with around the time Empress Masako was ill and would pass away. So her relationship with Prince Tamataka begins and ends in 1002. The reason it ends in 1002 is because that is when Prince Tamataka passes away. It seems he passed away from a plague that was hitting the city at the time. They did have a lot of plagues during the time. Of course, when I say relationship, they could not actually get married. I feel like they probably would have if they could. It does seem like the princes really loved her. Izumi Shikibu belonged to the provincial governor class, and Prince Tamataka was, as close as you could get to being emperor without being emperor, right? His father was an emperor, and he had two brothers who were also emperors. So a marriage between them just wasn't possible, but they did have a public relationship. Following his death in 1002, Izumi Shikibu would most likely have gone into a whole year of mourning. Typically, when someone dies, you would go into mourning, and the length of that mourning period is going to depend on how close you were with said person. So since she was a lover of Prince Tamataka, she probably would have done a whole year of mourning. So the Izumi Shikibu Nikki begins while in this mourning period. So it begins in what it describes as the 4th month of the year, which for them, the 4th month would be in our calendar, May. So it would be the 5th month for us. So the book begins in May. And when the book begins, she is still in mourning. This would be less than a whole year after Prince Tamataka's death, but it does seem like it is entering towards the end of that year of mourning. That is where the Izumi Shikibu begins, in May of 1003. So that's it for this section. In terms of the actual contents of the book, I'm not going to tell you anything about that. I don't want to spoil anything. It's hard to say spoil because it's not like there's huge things happening. I wouldn't say the plot is really the focal point. The focal point is really just focusing on the beginning of her relationship with Atsumichi and the emotions that they're feeling, all of the poems that they're sending each other. It's a very soft, I've expressed it before, it's just a sigh. Sometimes Heian Japan literature just feels like a sigh, and that's the case with this. So I'm not going to talk about exactly what happens in the Izumi Shikibu Nikki, but I will say that it runs the span of 9 months. So like I said, it begins in May of 1003, and it runs through January of 1004.
Lonely in her withering solitude, with none save me to visit her, what feelings must be hers, hearing the storm wind rage?
After the Izumi Shikibu Nikki has ended, what happens with the rest of her life? Her relationship with Prince Atsumichi begins in 1003 and runs through 1007. The reason it ends in 1007 is again because Prince Atsumichi passes away, just like with Prince Tamataka. So her year of mourning for him would have been 1007 to somewhere in 1008. And it's in 1009 where she gets appointed as a lady-in-waiting for Empress Shoshi. Now, other ladies that I'm sure you've heard of, especially one of them, who were also in this court were Murasaki Shikibu, who wrote The Tale of Genji, and Akazome Amon, who wrote The Tale of Flowering Fortunes, which I also love, by the way. Totally recommend reading. You can read it on Internet Archive if you like. Also, her daughter Koshikibu entered into service with her. So when Izumi Shikibu went into the court of Empress Shoshi, her daughter Koshikibu also did so as well. And then she would end up marrying a second time to Fujiwara no Yasumasa, who was also a provincial governor, just like her first husband, Tachibana no Michisada. I guess I never said that they separated. It's not known when they separated, but it's assumed they probably separated sometime around when her relationship with Prince Tamataka became public. So the rest of her life is kind of hazy, just like the very beginning of her life. There's not that much known, but there are some things that I can tell you about. So she would eventually leave the court of Empress Shoshi and go live in the provinces with Fujiwara no Yasumasa, and her daughter Koshikibu would stay behind and would continue to be a lady-in-waiting for Empress Shoshi. And Koshikibu would eventually pass away in 1025, and there are poems by Izumi Shikibu regarding this. In terms of when Izumi Shikibu herself actually passes away, again, it's not really known, but it's typically given that she passed away sometime in the 1030s. Now, Fujiwara no Yasumasa passed away in 1036, and it's not known when their relationship ended, but it's assumed that it did end at some point because there are poems from Izumi Shikibu where she mentions that Fujiwara no Yasumasa has forgotten her. So it's assumed that at some point they do separate, but they at least were still together by the year 1027. And this is assumed because there is a passage in The Tale of Flowering Fortunes that talks about how Yasumasa had been sent a letter telling him to send an offering to the capital for I think it was like a new Buddha statue that had been built. And when he sent this offering, there was also a poem sent by Izumi Shikibu along with it. So at that time, then they would have still been together. Now, the Tale of Flowering Fortunes gives the date as 1027. The dates in the Tale of Flowering Fortunes sometimes can be a little bit off. So it could have been 1027, it could have been 1026, 1028, but somewhere around 1027, they were most likely still married. And that's really it for the end of her life. Again, there's not a lot of dates known, but I do want to talk about those other two dates that I mentioned, which were the Imperial Waka anthologies. In 1005, and 1005 is a guesstimate on when the Third Imperial Waka anthology was finished. They don't really know when it was finished, but at least sometime in the first decade of 1000, you can say that it was finished. Basically what this is it's a anthology that is commissioned by the emperor, and it's an anthology of poetry, specifically waka poetry. This, I think, is significant because it's a pretty big deal if you get a poem published in the Imperial Waka anthology. I mean, that means that you have some of the best poetry. This is a poetry compilation that is, again, commissioned by the emperor, and it's supposed to compile and commemorate all of the best poetry in the country. But of course, all the people who are writing the poetry are predominantly in the capital. And the poem that's included in this first one is probably her most famous one. But I think it's significant of when she would have wrote this, she probably would have still been pretty young, because also the time between when an anthology is commissioned and completed can be pretty significant. Like the Fourth Imperial Waka anthology was completed in 1086, but it took a decade to finish. So it was commissioned almost a decade earlier. So I feel like it's kind of safe to assume that it probably was written sometime in her 20s, which shows how her poetry, even at a younger age, was starting to be seen with prestige and as some of the best poetry that they had. And then, of course, you can see the difference between that Third Imperial Waka anthology and the Fourth Imperial Waka anthology that was finished in 1086 and had 67 poems from her. She would be the most cited poet out of all poets, male or female, in the 4th Imperial Waka Anthology. And overall, she would end up having about over 200 of her poems published in Imperial Waka anthologies, because in the continuing 5th Imperial Waka, and I think even the 6th, they would also include some poems by her. So overall, she would have over 200 in Imperial Waka anthologies. In terms of poems that have survived, there are over 1,500, or about 1,500 surviving poems from her. And all of her surviving poems are in what is known as the Izumi Shikibu Kashu, and this kashu is composed of several different documents. 2 of the most important ones are the Seishu and the Zokushu. The Izumi Shikibu Seishu is just the main collection of her poems, and then the Zokushu is the kind of additional collection of her poems.
The more he studied her, the more he realized that she had never been hardened by the world. He was distressed at the way in which she seemed to be merely floating uncertainly on the surface of life, and spoke to her from the depths of his sympathy.
So now I'm going to get into the miscellaneous section. I don't know what else to call it, because there's just a few things that I want to talk about, mention. So we're just gonna get into that. You can read The Ink Dark Moon. You can purchase this for a reasonable price. This is from Vintage Classics, and this has poems by Ono no Komachi, who was also from Heian Japan period, and Izumi Shikibu Nikki. Izumi Shikibu Nikki and Ono no Komachi are kind of considered the most famous poets from Heian Japan period. And this is a compilation of some of their poems, because obviously the Izumi Shikibu Seishu and the Izumi Shikibu Zokushu are not translated into English in their entirety or anything. So if you want to find a way to read those poems, I mean, some of them will be in the Izumi Shikibu Nikki, but you can also find her poems in here. So a big chunk of it actually is Izumi Shikabu's poems, and this is one poem on each page, like this. And also, after Prince Atsumichi passed away, Izumi Shikibu, in her mourning, would write, I think it was over 100 poems. And they do include a few. At the top of the page, it'll say Poems Mourning Prince Atsumichi, and these are poems from the around 100 poems that she wrote after his passing away, in her grief for him. So you can find some of those in here, and then you can just find a bunch of other poems. All her most famous ones you will find in here as well. So this is great if you want to be able to read some of her poetry. I do think the translations in here are great, and you can also find some from Ono no Komachi as well, who was also a Heian Japan lady. Now, the next thing I wanted to talk about in the miscellaneous section is just a little disclaimer on what parts in this video are, I guess, debated amongst scholars as to what the real truth is, because I definitely present a lot of things in this video as like, these are the facts, these are for certain, but there are 2 things that I would like to bring to your attention that are somewhat debated. The first one is her real parents, specifically who her real father is. Now, I say that it's Oano Masamune, and I say this in the video as if that is who it is for certain, 100%, there's no debate, because I do think the evidence for it being Oano Masamune is the strongest by far, and it does seem like most scholars believe that it's Oano Masamune, and a lot of times when sources talk about her father, they will just say it's Oano Masamune. They don't mention that there's debate around it. I think it's okay when sources do that, because I do think the evidence of it being Oano Masamune is really strong. Just to make you aware that there is some question surrounding who her real father is. And the second thing that I want to make a disclaimer on is the actual author of the Izumi Shikibu Nikki. There is debate into whether it really was Izumi Shikibu herself who wrote the Izumi Shikibu Nikki, and a lot of this stems from the fact that the Izumi Shikibu Nikki is written in 3rd person, and it definitely reads different and was written differently than the other Nikkis of the time. In fact, Cranston mentions in his introduction that majority of the manuscripts for the Izumi Shikibu Nikki don't actually call it the Izumi Shikibu Nikki, they call it the Izumi Shikibu Monogatari, which I think makes a lot of sense if you've read the Izumi Shikibu Nikki. It does kind of read like a monogatari. I think he said there's only 2 manuscripts that call it the Izumi Shikibu Nikki. I think that alone can give you an idea of how this is written, the fact that it is called monogatari a lot of times. And so I think it makes sense that it can lead to questions surrounding, was this really her who wrote it? Or was it someone who knew so much about her life that they decided to write it down in a story-like format? Because a lot of the details in the book do match things that factually did happen in her life. And Edwin A. Cranston, in his introduction, really goes into a lot of detail surrounding the authorship and evidence for and against it being Izumi Shikibu. And if you're interested in that, then you can read his introduction to see what all the evidence is for and against. Now, I don't have a problem with just saying it's written by her, but I do think it's important to note that there is questions around it. Most Japanese scholars, from what I can tell, do accept that it's her. I think most of the evidence for them is compelling, and all of the evidence that they do have gives more weight to it being written by her, or at least by someone in her time period, rather than it being written by someone at a later date. Just to let you know that. And if you're interested in reading all the evidence and finding out what you think is most true or what you think the evidence weighs most heavy in favor of, then you can read the introduction where he goes into a lot of detail about it. Lastly, I just want to mention something that I thought was cool, and that's that there is a temple in modern-day Kyoto, I think Seishinen Temple. The legend at this temple is that Izumi Shikibu was its first chief priest, and that this temple was built for her by Michinaga. And in terms of if she was actually the original chief priest and if Michinaga really built the temple for her, I don't think that that's actually what happened. I think especially the dates don't make sense between when Izumi Shikibu would have actually been able to become a nun and when Michinaga passes away. Listen, it's a legend. Is it actually true? I personally do not think so. But is it cool? Yeah. And that's what I love about legends. A lot of times they're not true, but they're cool. So who cares? I think it's cool to believe that this temple was built by Michinaga for Izumi Shikibu, and she was the first chief priest. I think it's pretty cool. Again, is it really true? No, I don't think so. But is it cool? Heck yeah. And if I still gonna believe it? Heck yeah. So you can go to this temple, and there is a stone thing there to commemorate. It's hard because I can't read any of the stuff there, so I don't know what a lot of it says because it's all in Japanese and I can't read any of it. But so there's a big Buddha statue, and apparently all the little statues, which typically these are bodhisattvas, but apparently they're bodhisattvas of Izumi Shikibu and Michinaga. I can't read them myself. I can't read what they say, so I don't know if it's for certain, but from what I've been able to read about the temple, it does seem like those are bodhisattvas of Izumi Shikibu and Michinaga. But again, I can't read the inscriptions on them myself. There's also a stone monument thing that I think commemorates Izumi Shikibu, was built in honor of her. It's a very, very small temple, so it's not a popular attraction for tourists. They'd rather go to these big temples, but I don't know why you wouldn't want to go to the Izumi Shikibu temple, but whatever. I know that every year they have a ceremony where they celebrate the life of Izumi Shikibu. I did also find a Italian opera that was made. I couldn't understand any of it, obviously, because it's in Italian. The opera was about Izumi Shikibu's relationship with Prince Atsumichi. And I just think that's so cool. You can find it on YouTube. I think I listened to it on YouTube. I didn't listen to the whole thing because I couldn't understand any of it, so I just listened to a little bit. But if you know Italian, there you go. Another way to interact with Izumi Shikibu. So cool. That is all for Izumi Shikibu and the Izumi Shikibu Nikki. I really enjoyed being able to talk about this, and of course being able to talk about Edwin A. Cranston. To be honest, Edwin A. Cranston's translation was just so beautiful that he's the reason that he inspired me to want to make a video about the Izumi Shikibu Nikki. But yes, that's it. Thank you for watching. Bye.